Alright, today I'm teaching you how to find the exact values on the unit circle. Okay, and we're mostly going to just focus on radians. Alright, but before we start, let's go over some basic information that we talked about in class. So taking a look at the quadrants here, in quadrant 1 we know both x and y are positive. Right, so that means any angle in quadrant 1, all the trig ratios will be positive. So you know your answer will always be positive if the angle is in quadrant 1. Alright, if you're in quadrant 2, x values are negative, y values are positive, so the only positive trig ratio in quadrant 2 is sine. Okay, and its reciprocal, which is cosecant. Quadrant 3, x values are negative, y values are negative also. So the only positive trig ratio in quadrant 3 is tangent, or its reciprocal, cotangent. Okay. In quadrant 4, x is positive, y is negative. So the only positive trig ratio in quadrant 4 is cosine, or its reciprocal, secant. And an easy way to remember this, alright, so we have the first letter A, S, T, and C. So all students take calculus, so that's an easy way to remember which trig ratios are positive in what quadrant. Okay, and then over here we know that by definition that cosine represents the x-axis, so x is cosine, sine represents the y-axis, right? So y is sine, and then tangent is y over x, and we discussed why this is the case in class, right? And then their reciprocals, alright, cosine. So cosine is basically just 1 over x, because you're just flipping this, right? Because x over 1, you flip it, it's 1 over x. Same thing, cosecant, 1 over y, and cotangent, if you flip this, it's reciprocal. Alright, you'll just get x over y. Okay? Alright, so let's take a look at the unit circle now. And so if you take a look at all the radian measures that are divided by 6, right? Pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6. Well, you notice all their coordinates, right? The x and the y values, they're all exactly the same. Okay? The only thing that's different are the fact if x and y are negative or positive, right? So over here in quadrant 2, we know that the x values are negative, right? Y values are positive. In quadrant 3, we know that both x and y, both these values are negative. In quadrant 4, we know that y is negative, but x is positive. Alright? So basically, if you know the coordinates for quadrant 1, then you know that all the other quadrants, you know their coordinates also. You just have to understand, okay, is x or y negative or positive based on what quadrant you're in. Alright? And this is the case for all the other pretty much values too. Anything divided by 4, right? Divided by 3 pi divided by 4, 5 pi divided by 4, 7 pi divided by 4. And the ones divided by 4 are the easiest ones because x and y are exactly the same. It's rad 2 over 2 for both x and y. The only thing that changes is depending on what quadrant you're in, x might be negative or y might be negative, or maybe both are negative if you're like in quadrant 3. Okay? Same thing with anything divided by 3, right? All the radian measures divided by 3, pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, 5 pi over 3. All these values have the same x and y values as pi over 3. The only thing that changes is whether x and y is negative or positive. Okay, so what this means is if you know these right here, right? If you know these values right here, you can pretty much use these to find any other, coordinates throughout the unit circle. Okay. Alright, so with that being said, I'm going to show you an easy way to draw the first quadrant and find their coordinates anytime you need to. Right? Alright. So we have pi over 3 here up at the top, then we have pi over 4, and then pi over 6 on the bottom. And then obviously over here this is pi over 2. Alright. This and the values here we know are 0 and 1. Over here at 0 or 2 pi, we have 1 and 0. Now let's find these coordinates, and it's actually really simple how to find these coordinates. All right. First of all, you know that everything is always divided by 2 in the unit circle. Okay. And then all you have to do is go count 1, 2, 3, and then go back up 1, 2, 3. And then square root the top. So if you square root the top, you're going to end up with these values right here. Right? The square root of 1 is 1, so that's why there's no square root here. Okay, so you've just found all the coordinates for the first quadrant right here for pi over 3, pi over 4, pi over 6. All right. So now using this first quadrant, I'm going to show you how you could pretty much find the answer to any trig value on the unit circle using only just the first quadrant. Alright, so sine 4 pi over 3. Since we're dividing by 3, we know we're going to use the x and y coordinates from pi over 3. And sine represents the y-axis, right? So the y value here is rad 3 over 2. And then we just need to decide if our answer is positive or negative. Well, we need to figure out what quadrant this angle is in. Now, since pi would be 3 pi over 3, well, 4 pi over 3 would be a little bit past pi. So we know that we're going to be in the third quadrant, and in the third quadrant, we know the y values are negative, right? And then also, we know that in the third quadrant, the only trig ratios that are positive is tangent or its reciprocal cotangent, right? So we know sine then obviously would be negative, okay? Alright, so let's take a look at secant 11 pi over 6. Well, secant is the reciprocal of cosine, right? And since we're divided by 6, we're going to be using the x and y values from pi over 6. So we're dealing with cosine, so we're going to be taking the x values, right? And then we're going to reciprocate it because we're finding the secant of it, right? So 2 over rad 3. And then we're going to rationalize. We get 2 rad 3 over 3. And then we need to figure out which quadrant this angle is in. Well, we know that 2 pi in this case would be 12 pi over 6, right? So 11 pi over 6 is going to be in quadrant 4. And then if you remember from our shortcut, all students take calculus in quadrant 4, cosine and secant are positive, so you know our answer is positive, okay? And also in quadrant 4, the x values are positive. So that's how else you would know your answer is positive, right? Alright, so tangent negative 7 pi over 4. Well, since we're dividing by 4, we know we're going to be using the x and y values from pi over 4, right? And tangent, we know, is y over x. In this case, since they're the exact same thing, basically, you know that your answer is going to be 1, right? Because you're taking rad 2 over 2 divided by rad 2 over 2. So you know your answer is going to be 1. Now, should it be positive or negative? Well, that depends on the quadrant we're in. And negative 7 pi over 4, right? So now we're rotating clockwise. So if we go all the way around, that would be negative 2 pi, right? So in this case, negative 8 pi over 4 would be negative 2 pi. But we're at negative 7 pi over 4, so we know that's right? That's right before completing a whole circle. So we're in quadrant 1. Well, in quadrant 1, everything is positive. So we know that our answer is positive 1. Okay? So let's take a look at cosine 3 pi over 2. Well, 3 pi over 2, that's just one of the spots you just need to have memorized. Alright? Our key spots, remember, are pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And at 3 pi over 2 right here, the coordinates are 0 and negative 1. And since we want cosine we know are the x values, so that equals 0. Right? So, real easy. And then let's say, try a different example. How about secant negative pi? Okay. Well, secant negative pi is going to be in the same spot as pi. It's just where you're rotating, all right, clockwise. So if you rotate clockwise right here, that'll make the pi negative instead of positive. And then the values here we know are negative 1 and 0. And secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So the x value here is negative 1, and if you reciprocal it, right, well, you're still going to get negative 1. So your answer is negative 1. Okay, so let's take a look at tangent pi over 2. That's another one of the spots we just need to know. So pi over 2 is right here. Our coordinates are 0, 1. Well, tangent we know is y over x. So the y value here is 1. The x value is 0. We know we can't divide by 0 in math, so at tangent pi over 2, we know that that is undefined. Alright, so next thing, let's take a look at cosecant negative 7 pi over 6. Well, dividing by 6, we know we're going to be using the x and y values from pi over 6. And cosecant is reciprocal with sine. So the y value is 1/2, so we're going to do the reciprocal of that. That's going to be 2. And then let's see what quadrant this angle is in. We're going to be rotating clockwise. So negative pi would be negative 6 pi over 6. And since we're at negative 7 pi over 6, we're going to rotate past this a little bit, so we know we're in quadrant 2. Well, in quadrant 2, the only values that are positive, right, is sine or its reciprocal, cosecant. So we know that our answer is going to be positive. Or just remember, in quadrant 2, remember the y values are positive here, right, and sine represents the y values. Okay, so cosecant 23 pi over 4. The first thing you need to recognize here is, hey, I'm going to rotate more than one time around the circle. Okay, but first of all, since we're dividing by 4, we're going to be using the x and y values from pi over 4. And then cosecant, that's reciprocal with sine. In this case, it really doesn't even matter since they're exactly the same. So we know that we're going to take the y value and flip it. So that'll be 2 over rad 2. And then we rationalize, we're going to get 2 rad 2 over 2, and then the 2's divide out. So you end up with just rad 2. Now you need to decide, alright, is my answer going to be positive or negative? So we need to know what quadrant we're in. And there's two ways for you to kind of figure this out. The first way is to basically, since we know we're going to rotate more than one time around the circle, so if we're dividing by 4, 8 pi over 4, that's 2 pi, right? This is 2 pi. That's one time around the circle. Well, how many times is this going to happen? Well, we had another 8 pi over 4. All right, that would be 16 pi. So we're rotating 2 times around the circle already. And then we'll have to rotate another, I believe. So 8 and 8 is 16, so we need another 7 pi over 4. Okay? So if you add up basically all the numerators, you're going to end up with 23 pi over 4. So this is the same thing as 23 pi over 4. So the only thing that's happening is you're going all the way around the circle twice, around the circle once here, right? Then you go all the way around the circle again. And then you got to go another 7 pi over 4. Well, where's 7 pi over 4? That's almost another full circle. We're in the fourth quadrant. Okay? So that's one way to figure it out, right? So our answer, since we know is in the fourth quadrant, sine in the fourth quadrant we know is negative. So our answer is negative square root 2. Another way to figure this out is to change this into a mixed number. So if you change 23 over 4 into a mixed number, that would be, I believe, 5 to the 3/4 pi. And basically this means that you're rotating 5 and 3/4 pi around the unit circle, right? So if you go, here's 2 pi, that's one time around the circle. Another 2 pi is 4 pi. And then since you got to go 5 pi, you're going to go to here. That's 5 pi, right? And then you need to go an additional 3 over 4 pi. Well, 3 over 4 pi is 2 more quadrants, so you know you're going to end up in the fourth quadrant. So these are your two basic ways to figure out which quadrant you're in when you know that you're going to be rotating more than one time around the circle, right? So either change it to a mixed number or basically just break it down on this, since you know that you're going to be rotating, you know, a full circle either once or maybe more than once. Okay? Alright, tangent 31 pi over 6. Well, we know we're going to be using the x and y values from pi over 6. And tangent, alright, is pretty much, we know, y over x. So I'm going to take the y values from here, 1/2, and multiply it by the reciprocal of the x values. So that'll be 2 over rad 3. 2's cancel out. You get 1 over rad 3. You rationalize. You get rad 3 over 3. Okay? And then what quadrant are we in? Well, we know we're going to rotate, alright, around the circle at least once, if not more. So, like I said, you have two options. You can split this up. Since the denominator is 6, I know 2 pi is basically going to be 12 pi over 6, right? That's 2 pi. Well, that's 12 pi. Then we need to add another 12 pi, right? That's 24 pi. And then we need to add another 7 pi over 6, I believe. So that's 24 plus 7, that'll give you 31, right? So that means that 7 pi over 6, where is that? And we're rotating. That's a little bit more than pi, right? Because pi, right, would be 6 pi over 6. So we know that we are in the third quadrant, okay? And in the third quadrant, we know that tangent is positive. So your answer is positive rad 3 over 3, okay? Now remember, another way to kind of, instead of splitting this up, you can always change this into a mixed number. 31 over 6, that's the same thing as 5 and 1/6 pi, right? So if you're doing it this way, this means that you're going to rotate 5 pi, right? So what's 5 pi? Here's 2 pi, one time around the circle. Another time around the circle is 4 pi. And then 5 pi is, right, when you get to pi. And then you need to rotate another 1/6. Well, 1/6 means you move a little bit, and you're in the third quadrant, okay? So these are your two ways to kind of split it up and make sense of it and figure out what quadrant this angle is in, okay? Alright, so the last example, we've got cotangent negative 10 pi over 3. So first of all, cotangent, right, we've got divided by 3, so we're using the x and y values from pi over 3. And then cotangent, we know that's x over y. So I'm going to take the x values, 1/2 right here, multiply it by the reciprocal of the y values, since we're dividing by y. So we got 2 over square root 3. These divide out, I know 1 over rad 3, and then we rationalize rad 3 over 3. Now we need to decide should the answer be positive or negative. So let's find out what quadrant this angle is in. Now remember, you could change this to a mixed number. This would be negative, 3 goes into 10 3 times, and you'd be left with a third pi. So basically what this means is you've got to rotate, alright, since the angle is negative, we're rotating clockwise. You've got to rotate 3 pi. So that means here's 2 pi, negative, right? And then another pi. So we're at negative 3 pi right here, which is negative pi, right? So we're rotating clockwise, so all the way around is negative 2 pi. And then you've got to go another pi, that gives you the negative 3 pi. And then we've got to go an additional pi over 3. So additional pi over 3, that puts us in the second quadrant. Second quadrant, the only positive trig ratio is sine or its reciprocal. So we know that cotangent is going to be negative, right? The other way to do this, remember, we can split this up. Basically, negative 6 pi over 3, alright, that's 2 pi, or negative 2 pi. And then, well, we're getting to negative 10 pi, so that we need to add an additional negative 4 pi over 3. So this means we go around the circle, alright, one revolution, one time. That's negative 6 pi over 3, or equivalent to negative 2 pi. And then we need to go an additional negative 4 pi over 3. Well, negative 4 pi over 3, well, right here would be negative pi over 3, negative 2 pi over 3, and negative 4 pi over 3 puts us in the second quadrant. Okay, so you have two different ways of doing it. Whichever way you feel is easier for you is fine.